Hajime!
Quang Tri Province, Vietnam, 1967. Lordy lordy, it's July the 4th. Here we go again. Hot dog, hot time in the old towns tonight. Bet we make big contact. I'm sure we're going to have an exciting day of fireworks. Fuck you, Hatfield. We don't need that. At dawn on the 4th of July, 2 battalions of U.S. Marines began to advance cautiously into the elephant grass south of the DMZ. The regulars of the North Vietnamese Army were waiting for them. The Vietnamese were dug in, well concealed, and supported by heavy artillery from North Vietnam. Only a few miles to the north, and so it was that as the Americans pushed forward into the rising heat, Marines began to die. First to fall was Lieutenant Anderson of Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 9th Marines, shot in the head, leading his troops forward as they opened the battle by walking to an ambush. Anderson had never been much for taking cover. It's okay. God's going to protect me. By 11:15, when it pulled back to 200 meters and artillery was called in to sweep the front, Kilo Company had suffered 12 killed and 17 wounded. They had not seen a single enemy soldier. As Captain Giles prepared to withdraw, a Marine lying in front of his hedge, thought to be dead, sat up slowly and lit a cigarette. "Are you okay?" "No, sir. I'm just having a cigarette before I die." "What I want you to do is roll over on your face and crawl back towards us." "No, sir. Just leave me alone. Don't come get me. Leave me alone. I'm dying. I just want to have my last cigarette." After a more futile coaxing and agonizing as to whether to send soldiers out to get the Marine covered by an enemy sniper, he could not be rescued without exposing other Marines to fire. Captain Giles and his men left their wounded comrade to his fate. Captain Giles' decision to abandon the dying Marine seems peculiar in light of the purpose of Kilo Company's advance. For the objective of the Marine attack was not military in the strictest sense. It was to recover the dead bodies of 31 Marines abandoned on the field after an engagement of 2 days before. But in pulling back hastily to allow bombardment by artillery and airstrikes, during the 4-hour interlude some of the bombs fell short, wounding and killing Marines. Kilo Company had abandoned its 12 new KIAs in front of its lines. Now its first task was to recover them. In the process, the company took fire, and the company on its flank took casualties, 2 dead, 4 wounded. "We're taking too many casualties. We're going to pull back." Bullshit! I'm giving you a direct order under combat conditions to continue to move. Once the fresh corpses had been secured and manhandled back, the Marines withdrew for the night to the line they had held during the American bombardment. During the morning of July 5th, 6 Marines were wounded by enemy mortar fire, and American artillery and airstrikes pounded the area in front of their lines. Now the Marines began to creep forward once again toward the original bodies. But, as so often in Vietnam, this was to be a battle without climax. The NVA had withdrawn during the night, and the battered bodies of the Marines killed 3 days earlier were recovered without further incident. They were bagged by Marines wearing gas masks against the stench, piled high on tanks, and dispatched by stages upon their dolorous journey back to the United States. "We don't leave our people," Lieutenant Howe told the New York Times about the operation. "I'm sure they do the same thing for me." Insistence on the recovery of their dead has long been part of the code of the U.S. Marines, and this creed has spread through the American armed forces to become a characteristic feature of the American way of war. It is not unusual for the recovery of dead bodies to generate more dead bodies, as it did in Quang Tri Province. Enemies quickly learn that Americans return for their dead. As the Combat After Action report on this battle observed, NVA forces seem to be fully aware of the Marine tradition to remove all wounded and dead from the battlefield. Evacuation efforts were covered by enemy artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. This predictability gives the enemy the initiative. Baiting ambushes with the corpses of American soldiers or booby-trapping them was perfectly usual in Vietnam and has remained so in subsequent American campaigns in Somalia, in Afghanistan, and in Iraq. Soldiers explain the imperiling of live soldiers to bring in the bodies of their dead comrades as fundamental to morale and unit cohesion. It is the pledge of the group to the individual, which allows the group to demand in return that the individual risk his life. This is ample justification, but the practice nonetheless depends upon a particular set of beliefs about the sanctity of the human body, even if the spirit has fled, and of the soil of the United States. "We need to find this man," said a Marine about the body of an admired sergeant later in the Quang Tri battle. "We needed to make sure that this man came out unmutilated." That's what the enemy did with our Marines. They mutilated them. The most important thing was to find this great Marine and bring him home to the United States of America. The bodies had to be recovered, even if, given the American reliance on artillery, bombs, napalm, to clear the ground before the infantry advanced, the process of recovering them frequently mangled them far more than the most fiendish enemy could. American concern for the prompt recovery of soldiers' dead bodies is hardly unique, but it places Americans in the company of peoples with whom they might be surprised to be classed. The Homeric and classical Greeks, for example. The Romans were far less concerned about recovering their dead, and the warlike tribesmen of Highland Papua New Guinea. These are peoples who fight wars in ways we call ritualized, meaning they allow their beliefs to dictate a mode of fighting less ruthlessly efficient than we could devise for them. There are other ways too, in which beliefs draw modern armies away from purely efficient methods of killing. The reluctance, since World War I, of many enemies to employ poison gas and the practice of preserving the lives of prisoners. Such restraints are powerfully reinforced by the scorpion sting of the Golden Rule. Soldiers do not want to be gassed themselves, and they want their own surrenders accepted. But such restraints are grounded also in shared belief, the belief that war has rules, however fragile, and that there are appropriate ways of killing and methods of killing too horrible to be used. Where such beliefs are not shared, as in the Pacific Theater in World War II, for example, fighting achieves a singular brutality. Nevertheless, from the perspective of several thousand years in the future, an observer might conclude that our contemporary methods of fighting are scarcely less ritualized than those of Greeks and tribesmen of New Guinea. However primitive or sleekly modern the machinery of war, the idiosyncratic beliefs of the men of every time and place play their role in how war is fought. Welcome, legionaries, to the transmission. Agonia. No, in all seriousness, though, this is something that usually comes up in conversation, especially if you talk to communists or their adjacent pinkos, your typical liberal individual who scorns antiquity and believes there's no connection between the present and the past, or rather, what is to say, instead of seeing it as a linear progression, they don't see time as a flat circle. They see it as something that is long gone, has no effect, has no bearing. There is no perennial principle that comes and penetrates all panes of time like a golden thread and binds us together. Forget the fact, of course, that war is still waged by human beings, and biologically speaking, we have not changed much in the last 10,000 years since the agricultural revolution, and which is the locus, of course, of political and thereby military objectives and reasons for fighting. So usually the people that do so, that believe this false equivalence, or rather this false perception, that the past has no bearing on the present, are very much the reason why we have lost every war since Vietnam. Okay? That's the reality of it. And it's because of these men and women, etc., whatever, bugmen, that America is on the descent. And hence why we have this legion here, rekindling key ethos points of, I guess, spiritual flames, which transcend time. Okay? The passage that I read to you came from this book, great book that I highly recommend, called Soldiers and Ghosts by J.E. Lendon. And like I said before, I will always have the information on the transmission of any books that I reference or whatever, so you can read it yourself. But here's the thing. I'm not providing you anything new. I'm providing you something, let's say, an old truth that is deliberately obfuscated from contemporary reality because of the reason why that it is impossible. It is impossible for the communists to win without being able to clean away the past. And this is why they fail, and this is why they lose, and this is why pinkos lose. You know, the people that call themselves liberals, Democrats, whatever, they're just communist bugmen. This is the same thing, okay? And I hope you understand the long-winded intro here, and the reason why I'm trying to reference this is because ultimately, whether you like it or not, whether the purposes you enjoy or you support are present in the conflicts ahead, the conflict itself, that storm of war, is coming. Like the seasons, you can't stop winter. And I think you must understand that war is on the horizon and things are really not pacifying. It may be the case that the crisis at the current time, and the crisis I'm referencing is the twin danger of the invasion of Taiwan and the conflict in Ukraine, not to mention, of course, the Iranian interdiction of American international sea lines and the conflict going on in the Near East. The reason why I bring this up is because no matter what kind of munitions we use, such as hypersonic missile batteries, or what kind of mental manipulation we use, by which means, such as through the internet, or through things as obsequious and strange as, for instance, embedding light patterns in the teleprompter of your computer to induce cerebral, effects on targeted populations, so that way the emotions of that population will be more susceptible to defeatism and demoralization. Whatever the means, it is always fought along the same ends, right? For the same ends. Control over human space and the will, right? So the human will. To subdue the human will or to destroy it utterly. We bring this up because in the wars to come, there's a dynamic needed to be underlined when it comes to waging war. And that is, of course, the ethics by which we engage in war. And I'm not this ethics homo, okay? I'm not like here to browbeat you about be a good boy. In fact, I want you to be bad boys. But I think you have to understand the warrior's code and the understanding of the world as it appears to us. And why is it that regardless of humans' interaction with the classical antiquity that we so much reference as a font of spiritual vigor we usually drop from here in the West, most nations fall along the same lines of practice that we do. And so in this transmission, what we're going to do is examine the very origins of Western civilization in Homer. And to understand what Homer is really an epic of war. That is the birth of the West. It was birthed in a storm of fire and men and blood and guts and spearheads and bronze tips and armor sets and tears and joy. That is how we were born. Okay? And that's how we'll go out someday, hopefully speaking. But that's something that I think most people lose sight of, especially because, in the West we have this habit of, it happened in the past, so it doesn't matter. I just gotta do what my job is. But I hope you can understand that the font of the past helps build that willpower in your heart. It helps you gain awareness of the environment in which you're in, especially a chaotic environment, which is the combat environment, and makes you understand a greater ethos than the slave ethos, right? Instead of looking for being the good little boy for a shepherd and calling yourself a little lamb, I'm here to tell you, men and women, how to be wolves, how to suckle at the teat of a she-wolf, and create great cities worthy of dying for and loving for millennia, like Rome. In any case, I get a little bit too distracted with myself. But let's return to Homer. Rage, goddess. Sing the rage of Peleus' son, Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls. Great fighters' bodies shattered, and the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Book 1, lines 1 through 5. So this is the beginning of the Iliad. That main odyssey in which we always hearken back to. Witting or unwittingly, people don't understand that there's this concept, basically, that neo-pagan, neo-spiritual bullshit people are talking about. It talks about, visualization, manifestation. Well, that's actually based in actual somewhat cerebral or psychological truth. There's this phenomenon where in a group body, people who visualize certain events to happen and who articulate it through word of thought and through expressing artistically, philosophically, or even intentionality, attitudes, etc., things that are pretty not apparent, they're subtle. They actually affect the world a lot. They affect how we organize with each other and what ends end up coming to fruition. So visualizing things, and it has a physical effect on the world. I know this sounds kooky, I get it. Just bear with me here. I promise I'm sober this time, so I'm not just talking out my ass. But I'm going to link the study and a number of studies in the description below, because I want you to read this so that way you think that I'm not going crazy, but take my word for it. There is copious evidence that visualization, quote-unquote, manifestation is real, and it has material effects. Now, why do I reference this? Because ultimately, what is Homer? What is the Iliad? What is the Odyssey? It's a type of manifestation. These works weren't necessarily written by one person, okay? Homer was compiled over I think it's roughly a few hundred years. It is something that was an epic poem. For those of you who don't know, in archaic Greek, they remember things in didactic hexameter. Forgive me if I mispronounced or misspoke the word, but basically what these guys would do is sit there and memorize thousands of lines of poetry, epic poetry, by rote memory. Just memorizing the shit. And obviously going around and singing it. Now, you have to think about this before the time of wide-ranging literacy, okay? Literacy, especially like the mass proliferation of literacy, is only very recent. I mean, really, the early 1900s is when you start seeing even the peasants being able to read, the idiots, right? So before this, you know, writing and reading was the preserve of a cultural aristocracy. And even then, because of either dyslexia or disinterest or whatever, some of them couldn't read sometimes. Now, if you go even further into remote antiquity, the ways that cultural impulses were preserved were through these poems. But think of the secondary and tertiary effects of only hearing the stories of Achilles and Hector, Diomedes, Menelaus and Agamemnon. Their exploits in the Trojan War ultimately have an impulse. They cultivate the individual who's listening, and through the cultivation of that individual, his actions throughout his life, witting or unwittingly, will mimic the patterns, the song which he heard earlier. The scope, the mental horizon of his mind was completely encompassed by this man called Homer. Okay? And so, ultimately, Greek civilization should be seen as a tapestry. The Hellenes were a tapestry woven together and broken apart along the lines of Achilles and the wars that were portrayed within, and the general principle of the agon. So the Greek pursuit of excellence, to be preeminent amongst men, to be remembered forever. The Greek called kleos optiton, which is, the Greek for undying fame, ever-flowing fame. These are things that are as old as time. And of course they had their biological font in these people who are very unique. Very unique. However, the most unique thing about them is the ability to transpose the Homeric ethos, the warrior ethos, onto future generations and alien peoples and make them quote-unquote civilized, right? So to make them Hellenes in their own image, right? And you see this with the conquests of Alexander the Great of Macedon. He conquered East, proliferating Greek civilization, namely in the form of the Iliad. And then, of course, you see Romans constantly referencing and learning from the Greeks via the Iliad. Many people, for instance, the Romans based their legitimacy from Aeneas, who is the descendant of someone who escaped the pillaging of Troy and the sack. So, I mean, aside from the cultural impulse, I think a lot of people take for granted what it means that these words have an effect on real life. When commies say your thoughts and your words affect actions, they're right. They're absolutely right. And I'm tired of pretending it doesn't. It doesn't affect people. It does. And hence why it's important to be able to censor bad things and to champion the good, right? But what is the good? And the good starts here with Homer. And I wanted to go back to that book, Soldiers and Ghosts, and give you some perspective as to what Bronze Age warfare was like, And just encapsulation, how it goes is thus. Two hosts would often find each other, and before the battle lines were joined, champions of the both hosts would run out and challenge the other to one-on-one duels of combat. And of course, the tradition would be the slain would have his weapons and his armor taken as loot by his opponent, right? And you see this in kind of a fantastical fashion with Achilles dragging the entire body of Hector. Not just his suit of armor and his weapons, but also his physical body, claiming it as spoils of war. This is similarly what would happen. Now, also, I think it's important to take note of that to be able to do this duel one-on-one, you know, these battle lines were two masses fighting each other. To be able to be a champion and to go out in front of the battle lines and challenge the other opponent, you actually had to be running out way ahead of the main mass, the main body of men, right? The main formation. And that in and itself was a testament to the individual champions or the heroes champions physical prowess. I mean, it was no small feat. Everyone was super fit back then, as you know. Like, natural selection was going freaking crazy, and so anyone who was infirm or incapable were often discarded, right? And I mean, discarded or, you know, obviously taken by nature itself, etc. And so people were really healthy and really strong, and all they did all their lives was run, ride horses, fight, practice again, fuck, bang pussy, go back again, you know, train. And so this is what their lives are like. The patterns of their lives is just constant conflict. Not to mention, of course, what we consider low-level intensity violence all the time, because the rule of law wasn't as strong back then, and therefore men were more prone to executing the law on their own behalf. So, for instance, for those of you who don't know, in Rome, every citizen was an executor of the law, let alone, you know, obviously as a protected citizen, but he was an executor. There was no such thing as a police, okay? So every man, even if you weren't part of the warrior caste, right? Because back then, you have to remember, society was like a pyramid, right? I mean, it still is. They just lie to you, right? But at the top, there's like the, you know, the priests, and then there's the kings and the warriors, and then below them, the merchants and the, you know, all the sniveling merchants, the people that like making money. And then finally, you have the peasants, and the helots, and the slaves, and the labor. And it's actually kind of interesting how the Dorians perceived upper and lower, and what was the good and the bad. And they saw basically the slave and the underling as someone who was given away, whose station was given away by their beauty or their lack thereof. So, for instance, an ugly man was called kakos. But the interesting thing is that a coward was also kakos. And it's interesting to note that for the Greeks, physical beauty and spiritual beauty, you know, what you call ethics, but really virtu, right, in the Machiavellian sense of being courageous and strong and beautiful and full of vim and fervor, right? This was called beauty, arete, and the people that lacked it were ugly. And so there's no like lies that we learned from Platonists that you can divide the human body from their natural disposition. There are many sociological studies that show the uglier and the lower on the pyramid you are, the more likely you are to be naturally criminal, no matter how much money you have. The more likely you are to be more deformed, more stupid, more ugly, period. And obviously this is just a sociological trend, and I'm of the belief, of course, that with the will you can even overcome any mean origins, even if you're fuck ugly, okay? So don't worry, I'm not coming at your neck. But this is the Greeks' perception of things, and I kind of agree with them halfway, right? Although I have this belief in becoming. I don't believe in just being, I believe in a becoming. But anyway, that's kind of going long story short. Now, going back to Homer, you have to remember that the conflicts which arose between hosts, right, armies, were often very much kind of like crowds of dudes headed in a certain direction. And there's even this part in the Iliad where they give away how they organize their troops, and Agamemnon is given positive reinforcement about how men should be organized, to be organized by family, clans, and ultimately their polities, right? So that way they would be more brave and fight together. And he condemned the heroes, for instance Ajax, who would stray too far from his men or from the lines, and thus he would cause morale to sag from his contingent because of his dereliction. And this is, by the way, my esoteric reason why I love Agamemnon, right? Because he's actually a commander. He's the prototype of the commander, right? And he's showing people leadership principles, which before then had been truly expounded before. Most men know that in any fighting unit, it's not the measure of the man who makes up the individual enlisted or the ranks that make it or break the efficacy of that fighting unit. It's the leader, okay? It's the leader. I'm serious. And I believe this wholeheartedly, because human beings have such a propensity to improve drastically, quickly. And I mean, you see this in Jocko Willink's Extreme Ownership. You can take a shitty pile of bricks, rankers, and completely transform them into Myrmidon. And then you have a piece of shit officer, leader, who takes in charge of his own Myrmidon, and then they kind of waste away and become as ineffective as any lowly levy of peasants with a spear and a shield. So there are a number of different things that happen from Homer, right? But the most important thing, which I believe is important for you and I to understand, is the glorification of the here and now. That life is a spiritual event. That there is no dichotomy between here and the thereafter. That ultimately the gods and man fundamentally inhabit the same world. That they have effects that affect both of each other's fates. And that ultimately, there's no heaven. Does that make sense? And so when I read to you that exposition about the bodies of men, of Marines in Vietnam, the reason why they're being taken back, and this far precedes Christian theology bullshit, okay? This goes way into remote antiquity, is the belief that man's body was one and the same with his soul, and that he went down to Hades with his body, okay? I know this sounds crazy, but that's what the Greeks believed. They believed that the body and the soul were like inextricably linked, hence why if you're ugly, you're spiritually ugly, and vice versa. And that ultimately the recovery of the body, the proper cremation, right? The proper cremation and giving money for the ferryman is ultimately what will help him, survive in the afterworld. And you have to pour wine and make libations on the battleground. In fact, if you zoom forward in the Peloponnesian War, there was this great calamity that happened to the Athenians, and that their fleet sank, and it was in the middle of a storm. And ultimately the admiral made the call to return to port, instead of making an effort to recover the bodies that had been sunk at sea because, of course, the precarious position. But when he returned, the people of Athens condemned him because it was an immense sacrilege, and that now scores of men were doomed to wander this plane as lost souls, as like specters that would haunt their families and that could give no rest, would always be hungry for the blood of men. And obviously we don't justify it in the same way. I don't even think most people cognitize it the same way. Our time is so completely spiritually impoverished due to the effects of the Enlightenment, quote-unquote rationalism, all the BS that comes from Pomo shit, basically disenchanting the world, that we wouldn't understand. But I'll give you something that we can understand, and I hope I've indicated it to you before, is that life, as Nietzsche says, is fundamentally aesthetic, okay? And remember what I said to you, what the Homeric Hellenes believed about the good and the bad man, or rather, the beautiful man and the ugly man, the excellent man and the lackluster man, right? What did they say about him? When they talked about his bravery, they talked about his beauty and his excellence, his bravery, his strength, his Andrea, right? His manliness. And then, of course, the opposite. When people remarked about their cowardice, they were called kakoi, right? So they were cowards, but also the uglies, right? Plural, the uglies. I know, crazy. Bear with me here. So what I'm trying to tell you is that basically the Hellenes believed that life is an aesthetic event, and that it is fundamentally a spiritual event, and that it is a physical event, all at one time. There's like 3 strands happening at one time, and this tapestry is inseparable, and there's nothing you could do to stop it, and that all these things play out. Most people nowadays take spirituality to be this weird, nerd stuff where you go into a big stone building and you mutter certain words and blah 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 and all this BS. No. Spirituality, especially for us, we Indo-Europeans, for us, life itself is the spiritual event. Combat itself is the crescendo of life. Death, slaying of the enemy, victory, the tears of defeat, the joy of overcoming great odds and a great enemy. That is the spiritual catharsis. That is what had been lacking in the late Roman Empire, which gave rise to slave moralities, which were born from the fact, and the Elysian mysteries before it, that were born from the fact that there was simply no catharsis anymore. Men and women have become so decayed by material excess and peace, imagine that they had to renounce themselves to a religion of death and call that life. Isn't that interesting? It reminds me of communists. They're always really good at gaslighting people, right? They'll say things to the effect of, love is love and blah blah blah. They'll say, which is the same effect of, they take a shit on your plate and they'll call it a burger, right? But then you put it in their mouth and they'll, and then they'll cry and scream and you'll say, well, don't tell me you're not full of shit then. Same thing with the Christian dogma, and before that, the Platonist stuff. A lot of it's just mind games. But the Homerics were beautiful because they were self-consciously understood reality as good, as the spiritual, as the truth. Reality is the truth. What is happening here and the now is the truth. And that's very difficult for many of you to accept, and I get that. And I'm not trying to come at the necks of specific people, but this is where the Homeric ethos and why I believe the martial ethos is not like martial particular, which calls to mind only a very specific vision of life, a very specific vocation of life. It is actually my conviction that the ethos expounded in the Iliad is the universal one. It's the one that is most true. Because even before, whether combat and war is fundamentally the combat of wills, right? So it's basically man against man, army against army, spear against spear, shield, and so on, right? And who wins is who is greater in will and strength. Okay? Now, this is just a crystallization, probably the most perfect human interpretation of something which already happens in nature. Nature itself, physis, right? The Greek physis, already is cruel. and harsh and unforgiving, but also has entirely a whole set of capricious assets too. You know, one day nature may smile on you, and the next it may take it away. But also, nature does this very important thing, is that she selects ruthlessly for the most beautiful and perfect specimens, right? Only the best survive. You and I are the descendants of very few Neolithic ancestors who survived, who were strong, and passed on their genes. You should see how women select sexually on dating apps. It's incredibly instructive because they're hypergamists. They select for winners. Nature selects for winners. You know what moralists select for? Especially Christians who protest the idea that the last shall come first. They select for losers. And that's why over 2,000 years we have bred ourselves down, away from this Homeric pinnacle. I apologize, I get too carried away, and I don't want to annoy the fuck out of you. That'll be my last fedora tipping event of this transmission. Returning, of course, to ancient Hellas. So, we have that foundation of archaic Greece. And remember, after the Trojan War, the Bronze Age collapse, it is likely that the Trojan War took place amid the tumultuous century or two of the Bronze Age collapse. And for those of you who don't know, this was an event in remote antiquity that portended the disruptive influence of iron, the transition from bronze to iron, the crop failures of the Mideast, so Mesopotamia, due to internecine warfare and droughts, and like certain climate factors, not climate change in the way they think about it, which is, you know, singularly in one direction or vector. It was simply atypical aridness that caused massive crop failure. And of course, remember that the agricultural revolution of 10,000 BC is something entirely new to human civilization, and therefore the cultivation of grains and other livestock fell victim far more easily than it would otherwise. So life was a lot more precarious, especially civilization. And I would even take it one step further. I think it's important to delineate what civilization means, okay? Because there is this understanding that just because humans get in a massive dog pile and they inhabit, you know, basically a favela-like complex together, that somehow that encompasses a civilization? No. What is a civilization? Well, a civilization is fundamentally an ethne, right? The Greek for ethne, of course, is where blood meets culture, okay? This is why the root fixture of ethnic is a cognate with ethic, okay? Because ultimately, peoples are usually construed and created over generations following one overarching quote-unquote constitution, one highest good, right? This is the 1,001 goals that Nietzsche alludes to, and Jacob Burckhardt, you know, definitely helps corroborate his evidence. But ultimately, the idea that a people is a mission enfleshed in reality over time, and that over time, generation over generation, this people becomes more distinct and unified towards these ends. Okay? So, the issue with the past, and that for most people, is that the human conglomerates of clans and stuff, they weren't self-aware in this way. They didn't have common values. The only common values, which happened in the remote past, especially when it came to the original inhabitants of Europe, like the original ones before the Aryan invasions, is basically what you would see anywhere in a third world shithole favela. There's a complete lack of self-understanding and cognitive fixation on the future. Like, there is no mission, right? So remember how I told you the Hellenes are defined by their universal, the universal trait and the defining zeitgeist, right? The thread that was the anchor thread that gave context to all their actions was each individual Greek's desire to be seen as the most excellent of men in their techne, or whatever it may be. And for the Romans, it's my conviction that it's believed that they want to, similar to the Greeks, is not simply to excel all men, but to dominate all men in space and time, hence their claim to universal empire, etc. Or, for instance, the archaic Jews and their conviction of honoring mother and father. And we can see this central asset being the defining characteristic of why it is they have such a long continuity. For those of you who don't know, there are, like, the Jewish community has existed since like 6000 BC. You have even, there's this crazy like clay tablet of a basically a loan merchant, right? Interesting. Anyway, a loan merchant, talking about his family and alluding to the fact that he was, a Jew living in I think it was a Babylonian, Sumerian city, and the assets he had. Writing was really boring. Point is that ultimately a people is defined by their central mission statement, their commander's intent, right? Okay? And so civilization only comes into fruition with the Mycenaean Greeks, with obviously the ancient Egyptians, with the Babylonians, Assyrians, and many others, right? And I don't want to list them all, and I'm obviously not an anthropologist, so please take everything I say with a grain of salt. But the greater fixation that I'm trying to say and bring back this thread all the way that connects to Vietnam is that the echoes of this tapestry still holds true. When we weave the future and call it history, it is weaved from this anchor thread of the Iliad. Okay? We all dance and sing and fight and love and fuck and rot and eat and are born again onto this world through the eloquence of Homer. And I know this sounds crazy, but just bear with me here. Without further ado, let's finish the transition period. Greece goes through six stages, basically. In the Mycenaean Greeks, this is what we refer to as archaic Greece. And the Bronze Age collapse happens, the Mycenaeans go away, and then ultimately, Troy's sacked, Aeneas goes to his, he has the Aeneid, he ends up with Queen Dido in Carthage, does not like, her style, ends up going to Italy, settling Italy, his descendants become Romulus and Remus, and so on. Anyway, but in the time around roughly 700 BC to 400 BC, there is this period of time where the Homeric ode is being layered on. It's understood that in the beginning, the Iliad was a lot shorter and, less embellished. And as time went on, and the different regions of the Hellenes, the different peoples of the Hellenes, they added their own layers and added their own figures from antiquity and transposed them inside. And there's like very interesting idiosyncrasies that happen between the different Greek nations. So within the Greek sphere, there are like the Aeolians, the Ionians, the Dorians, and etc. So you have to understand that all these people over time organically weave into this tapestry, this constitution almost of their people that's unique to them, and ultimately spins out, and we see it in history. But as time goes on as well, there's this rise of the polis. What is the polis? For many of you who are aware, it's that, Hercules, you watched Disney, right, when you were a kid? I did. I fucking love that dude. Well, the polis came from the original term Acropolis. Okay? This means fortified place. In archaic times, especially in the Bronze Age collapse, Humans needed places where they could graze, raise their crops, but also in quick succession, if they fell under a raid or enemy action, that they could retreat with themselves and their family up to a natural stronghold. In Athens, the Acropolis, where there is a massive temple built, was originally the original stronghold of the Athenian people in remote antiquity, right? Well, later, the polis arrives, and the Politeia. And so, what is this? It's more than a city. People don't understand what a city means nowadays. Today, especially if you're in America, it's basically, some boomer who just took a diarrhea shit on a map and decided this will be suburbs. Whoa. And there is no reason or spiritual feeling to a city, especially the newer ones that are built after the colonial times. They have no feel for them. It's all very mercenary, very mechanistic. But you have to remember that the poli, they grew organically. They first were an acropolis, a stronghold that maybe a tribe or a clan happened to occupy, and slowly, either by growth, natural growth of their family expanding out, or passers-by ameliorating themselves to that clan and getting, cohabiting with each other over time, the settlement starts to grow, slowly but surely. In Athens, for instance, the oldest quarter, you can still see the traces of this organic development because the roads themselves are still traced along the lines of cow pastures and cow trails. This is important. It's important for you to understand the implication of this, right? Because over time, as clan becomes town or village, and village becomes town, and town becomes city, there is this growing self-understanding, a growing sense of, not community in the Pinko sense, the community. No. I mean men and women who intermarry, who deal with each other, who fight each other, who have the greatest rivalries together, who live with each other, who have each other's back all the time, and ultimately exude power together, etc. And rely on each other. And over time, this natural organic growth of physical space, of population space, also becomes a natural cohesion. It becomes a unit. Okay? People don't understand another thing, that the polis was largely self-sufficient. In general, it was the fixture of the city, and the immediate countryside was what encompassed the polis. Everything within vision of the polis was generally conceived as the territory of that polis. Athens is the only example or exception, maybe, one of the few exceptions where everywhere in Attica was considered to be an Athenian subject. Otherwise, if you were in some other part of Greece, anyone that was outside of the visual range of the center of a polis, so basically the horizon, was considered not to be of that polis, to be a foreigner, or to be a barbarian, or to be an other of some kind. And the implication of this is just to give you the understanding that the polis wasn't just a town with a fixture, with a marketplace and whatever. No. These people were fundamentally family and a military unit. And you'll start to see this in the combats that they waged against each other constantly, and the ritualistic endeavors that it slowly became. Right? So during the Peloponnesian War, the general gist of the Peloponnesian War and how it amounted to what it is basically ended up being is the rivalry between the great city-state of Sparta and the Lacedaemonians and against the Athenians. And this happens right after the Persian War, where they successfully beat off the invasion of Darius. And ultimately, the Spartans are seen as the hegemon, which means the leader, right? Hegemon is just for leader, but it's also understood in our time as basically being the preeminent partner in an alliance of peers, okay? And the Lacedaemonians have this just enormous sway, especially from their reputation they had garnered from themselves from Thermopylae, but even before then, as being known as the most powerful military force the world has ever seen. Ever seen. They were the only nation in the general Hellenic world that devoted their entire citizen body to the exploits of war, that had engineered their entire polis and patterns of life to give rise to the greatest warriors ever seen. And what I mean by this, and you should read Plutarch on Sparta, but basically, for instance, the abolition of money, the equal distribution of land and property, so that way no man may envy each other for wanting more material things, but instead entirely focus competition between each other on arete, so excellence and virtue, which is to say, when Lycurgus remade Sparta, the city, he wanted man to focus on the important things in life, right? Your fucking soul, your ability to be the best, to do things that are good for the city as a whole, for yourself. And this is different, right, from our ethos. We believe that, that sounds communist, or blah, 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 blah. No, it's not communist, because the difference between the Spartans and the communists is this, is that the Spartans had contempt for the merchant and his petty self-interest for, material hoarding, right, and luxury and vice and weakness from above. He was a warrior. He was austere because his greatest aspiration was the accumulation of honor, of kleos, right, of kleos optiton, right? Whereas the modern communist, he completely discredits by his doctrine and by his understanding any understanding of human excellence. He doesn't want that. What he wants is complete leveling of humanity. No one is no different from anyone else. No one is no better at being acclaimed for successes than anyone else. Everyone is equal. Everyone's a number. So basically, the communists are what the Helots were compared to the Spartiates. And the Helots, for those of you who don't know, are the original Messenians who had originally inhabited the land of Lacedaemonia. And when the Dorian invasion happened, I think this happened in the 900s or 800s, so the Dorians are totally different from the Spartans in the Iliad. And when the Dorians came down and conquered Lacedaemonia, they subjugated this entire nation of people as slaves, owned by the state, for the purpose of them alleviating the Spartiate citizen class, so that way the Spartiates were able to focus on what was important, so governorship, military matters, all the other stuff that's actually high order importance, and all the dumb chores that are required of man, so growing food, cleaning master's pee-pee or something, doing the laborious BS stuff that gets in the way of you cultivating excellence, was basically delegated to this low caste. And this is where the self-understanding of the communists come from. So it comes from the Helot, it comes from the slave class, it comes from that origin. They look up at people and they want to tear down people because they are so low. And it comes with incredible self-loathing and all this kind of stuff. And this is a major factor, by the way, throughout history, which is another thing that I think I want you to focus on, is see how the communist is not a singular event in time. The communist is, the small c communist, is a perennial factor of life. It is omnipresent. And, he's always existed. And the way to deal with him is always the same. Okay? That's the issue that most people don't get. but we'll delve into it later. So anyway, the polis goes on, and with it, it invents a new quote-unquote type or evolution of warfare. One primarily focused on teamwork instead of individual performance. And this is in complete contradiction to the impulse of the Greeks, of the Hellenes, right? Because remember, if you read the Iliad is just basically a series of duels, okay? And the dynamics of those duels, if you think about it, it's not just sitting there and fighting to the death like a cage match. Sometimes men run away. Sometimes men use trickery. Sometimes men take cheap shots, and so on. And so, and of course, this is not seen as cheap or bad. In fact, people say that even someone, for instance, the guy that fell Ajax, because he was much lesser in ability, his trickery wasn't seen as odious because ultimately how great the hero Ajax was. And so you should understand that this type of warfare is more fluid. It's not static. It's not like disciplined, stand your ground, like fight to the death kind of situation. It's almost like a sporting event mixed with a little bit of an alley fight, okay? And this changes. The polis ultimately fields armies made of hoplites. Hoplites are the men who are defined by their shields. And the citizen body or enfranchisement is usually in many different cities. So in Greece, the poli, were all organized along different lines. Some were monarchies, the other ones were aristocracies, and still further there were democracies. But the enfranchisement was limited to the hoplite class, no matter where you were. And the ones who had commanded a lot of power within any polis were the men who were fighters. So the men not simply who fought, but who were able to furnish for themselves all the heavy armor required of a hoplite, so greaves, cuirass, helmet, lance, sword, hoplon, and of course the ability, the enough wealth to be able to train in the gymnasia and leave the menial tasks of accruing wealth to yourself to his household and to his slaves. So he's delegating. So the idea is that the hoplite class is usually the upper middle class or the middle class that is able to furnish for himself all the trappings of war and the training, the constant training of war, which primarily focused not on the techniques of war or anything like that. It was very much simply physical fitness, being able to be physically strong and have a long endurance. Because as you'll see, the way that the phalanx originally was organized was so that basically it was like this. Imagine all these up-armored men, right? They're all together in close succession, and the hoplon mirrors very much the shield wall of the Vikings, right? It's one hoplon with big round bronze shield, embossed in, leather and wood, this heavy thing. It's like heavy. It's like 25 pounds heavy. And you think that's not much? My friend, if you're holding that for hours on the battlefield or marching with it, it is heavy. And so what they do is that it's slightly larger than the person that's holding it. So that way the hoplon is actually covering for his buddy who is immediately to his left. Okay? And this is vitally important because the cohesion of the phalanx is absolutely necessary to warfare and its outcomes now. Any break in the phalanx ultimately leads to an opening for which the enemy can penetrate the formation and cause more casualties. Once the phalanx disintegrates in its cohesion, ultimately that's when they turn and run as a collective unit. And that is when victory is usually declared. That's when de facto happens. And when they turn and run, that's when the victorious army ultimately runs them down and kills a score of them as they run away. It is only after the battle, where all is said and done, there's this ritual of the defeated army commander approaching the commander of the victorious army, permission to be able to collect the dead. Okay, and remember this from the Vietnam era, where we talked about how the Viet Cong and the NVA didn't allow or even use the corpses and the wounded of the enemy as ways to score more cheap hits. Well, this is the reason why there's this lack of synergy. The Americans, descended from this long tradition, ultimately, every time they go back and get the fallen soldiers in battle, what they do is relive this ritualistic warfare, which is, after a lost conflict, they, combat or clash, they go out and collect their dead and rebury them, right? And that's something that we kind of hold over, almost like a spandrel. It's very interesting how much people don't understand the origins of this practice, and that it reaches into really remote antiquity. I mean, even before the Bronze Age, something that we do just from time eternal, but really reached a ritualized crescendo in the Polis era. And the Lacedaemonians were known, for instance, when they won a battle, to not pursue the enemy very far. They held discipline very strongly as the highest virtue, and that ultimately they were known for that kind of self-restraint, and that usually endeared many of their foes to the Spartan hegemony because of their self-restraint, of their lack of vindictiveness and petty self-interest and scoring cheap kills. And so what happens over the next 200 years or so until the Peloponnesian War is this increasingly ritualized battlefield sequence. In fact, it became so spiritualized that the hoplite, the phalanx, was the only type of combatant on the battlefield. The battlefields became predetermined. The commanders of both sides would meet and agree to one flat place together, almost like a duel, and there would be no archers, because archers were considered to be cowardly and antithetical to the hoplite values. There was usually very little cavalry, especially amongst the Lacedaemonians, especially because it was seen as the arm where the cowards go because of their lack of utility. And remember, this was before stirrups, so they weren't leading decisive hits. What they were doing is running down enemies or flanking them to put pressure on the enemy mass. And the funny thing is that the Lacedaemonians sometimes would actually go into war, right, to the battle with head dressings and their heads garlanded with basically offerings to Ares, and their hair woven into locks, and this kind of almost pageantry and flowers and stuff is very interesting. But basically it became so ritualized that it just became almost not like warfare at all, but it became constricted within these very ossified bounds, and that usually the only thing that would really outcome the battle was moving this territory stone. So between cities there would be this marker, this territorial marker, and this marker after the battle would be forcibly placed on the battlefield of that victory. So you'd be, the Lacedaemonians would be shifting their dominion forward by placing this territory marker further and further into enemy territory every time they won that victory. But this all changed. But in first place, let me bear in mind something that you have to understand. In the Homeric period of war, man fought with bow, lance, shield, and everything else. He did things by sabotage. He was underhanded and full of guile, as you saw with Odysseus and the the sacking of Troy using the wooden horse and intrigues like that, ruse de guerre, and then it went out of vogue in this high Politeia era of Greece. War like that was shunned. Using the bow was seen as cowardly, and especially the cavalry. They were perceived as this kind of... I think there was this great quote by this Spartan who saw the reintroduction of the bow into warfare after the Peloponnesian conflict started to happen, and he said, alas, there is no more virtue in battle anymore. There is no more glory in battle because there's this cowardly weapon, right? So that this innovation is bad, and oh my God, it reminds you of many people who are downcast on industrial warfare because it's not this romanticized 1v1 test of, I don't know, brawn or whatever, or skill. I obviously very much disagree with this take, and if you don't mind me going down the rabbit hole here, the crux of combat, the crucible of modern combat, is fundamentally an emotional, spiritual one. And you'll find the answers to what the agon is in modern warfare through Ernst Junger, who experienced the first type, the first iteration of it, the complete lack of rhyme or reason to when you would die, or the skills required for X, Y, and Z to be successful, to win, and the impersonal way the soldier would be marshaled into war, and the lack of direct connection to that polis idea, right? So back in the day, you knew what you were fighting for. You were fighting for your family, your gods, and the bones of your fathers. They're all buried back home. Again, another allusion to why it's so important to recover those bodies for those Americans in Vietnam and place them in the United States. This polis ethic that we inherited from the Greeks. And so people think that it diminishes war as a spiritual experience. In fact, I think quite the opposite. I think it heightens war. It makes it more Homeric. It makes it more aesthetic. It makes it something completely internal and independent of the outside. And I think the interesting thing is that the phalanx era of the polis was actually the lowest ebb of Greek martial culture. Okay? And I think that it shows, especially with the attitudes of the Greeks, when it came to how they trained their hoplites, which is to say, they trained them not at all. They did basic maneuvers with the phalanx unit. They worked out, went to the gym, but that was it. Conflict in the phalanx was just basically you having your spear over your head and stabbing at the enemy until either they died or you died, and someone won. There was no guile. There was no tact. There was no... nothing. And the only ethic that we inherited from this era, which is a good, in my opinion, is this idea of, for instance, I think it's Sallust that says this, a man may fall, but he must never bend. Which is to say, a man must stand his ground, no matter the odds, and if he falls, that is a matter to the fates and the gods. But the ethic is to be courageous. And the most interesting thing, you see this in history, is actually the story of this guy, the Spartan dude, who actually goes into battle with an anchor tied to his armor to hold him down in the battle place. In short, saying, I will not leave this position, death or victory, this is where I stand. And so this ethic of what's called passive courage, the ability to stand your ground, is really heightened and brought to the fore of the cognitive imagination of the warrior, the ability to sit there and stay. And I think the book, by J.E. Lendon, really encapsulates what I'm trying to say here, so just bear with me. I'm reading from him now. An Athenian epitaph reads thus: Under this monument lies Aclius the Athenian, Euphorion's son, who died in the wheat lands of Gela. The grove of Marathon, with its glories, can speak of his valor, Alcae, in battle. The long-haired Persian remembers and can speak of it too. This is the epitaph of Aclius the tragedian. Even a man of such eminence in another realm, and in 2 sea battles, wanted to be remembered chiefly for his bravery when fighting as a hoplite at the Battle of Marathon. In classical Greek, arete is casually used to mean courage alone, and the rich Homeric status terms agathos and kakos need mean no more than brave and cowardly, respectively. Just as the Iliad had failed to rank excellences, so it had failed to decide on which behavior really was courageous. In the Iliad, bravery is manifested mostly in aggressive performance, but holding one's ground is praised as well. If one is to be preeminent in battle, he must by all means stand his ground strongly. Quotation. Sometimes the poem treated holding one's ground, what might be called passive courage, as being demanded by the heroic code, sometimes not. Historical Greece decided firmly that it was part of the code. To Tiresias and his contemporary Callinicus, there is no question that running is disgraceful. Indeed, when defining perfect arete, Tiresias depicts the warrior as a man who, quotation, plants himself firmly and holds his place among the foremost warriors unceasingly, disgraceful flight completely forgotten, and has schooled his heart and soul to endure. This is a man excellent, agathos, in war. So, as you can see here, there's a dichotomy, right? There is an emerging dichotomy, or rather re-emphasis, on what it means to be courageous. What is the highest valor and honor? What is the courage? And this comes from a time when running or being a coward directly lent to the slaying of your friends, the death of your friends. So there's this increased solidarity, this emphasis on teamwork and unit cohesion that I alluded to earlier, but goes beyond simply what you might understand as individual valor. This individual valor is under the context of a greater whole, a greater phalanx, if you will, which is another thing that I hope people really imbibe into their lives, is that this courage and fidelity to friends, right, which is what it really is by proxy, is a fidelity to friends, is fundamentally a function that we should really kind of reacquaint ourselves with, because in America, especially since the Enlightenment, there's this emphasis on being an individual, right? Everyone's a freaking individual. Everyone's a little princess, has to have it their own little way, right? Well, guess what happens? The individual is the most granular, atomic, most conquered piece of human flesh out there. So a lot of people like to say, oh, the individual is sovereign, the individual has the most power, he who is individual and alone, blah, 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 is the most powerful. Bullshit. Bullshit. You know why I say that? Because ultimately, kings and rulers of great realms, greater than anything you yourself have ever ruled as a team. He did not govern his realm alone. He didn't do things by himself. He delegated to commanders and to his retainers and so on, and inspired his team to follow him. So though, yes, he's prominent and he's making a lot of the shots and calling a lot of the calls, at the end of the day, he was part of a team. A preeminent individual is always a leader, and a leader presupposes a following. An atomic individual is a slave. And the Greeks had a really good impulse or instinct towards this. They called the individual without a polis a barbaroi, the barbarian, someone who was unwell in the head, who was simply not civilized, who had no allegiance to oneself, who was readily predated upon, who was readily destroyed. And you see this now, but you see this more profoundly in, for instance, the great latifundia of the Helots in Sparta, or the slaves in Rome, where slaves were basically individuals netted up and forced into labor. There was no cohesion. They were basically human household appliances, okay? And the only thing they could offer is their techne, so basically their skill in whatever BS that they do, And that was that. And they had no friends, no true friends, especially among slaves, is just as they say that there is no honor amongst thieves, but truly there is no honor amid helots, who deceive and inform on each other for the good graces of their master, the dominos. And so you have to understand that individualism is pushed because they want you weak. They want you to be an individual so they can defeat you and destroy you, so you don't have a phalanx, so you don't have a buddy to your left and to your right who's protecting you, who you protect, who you have a greater devotion to. Because only teams beat individuals all the time. And so what's the best way to destroy your enemy's teams? It's by brainwashing them into thinking that being an individual is superior to being a team. That is not so. All great things, all great achievements have always been made by teams. Even the great men of history that you read on the pages of any textbook always were the first and foremost leader of men. Okay? So, anyway, just going back, this is Alke, excuse me. That passive courage of the phalanx. And finally, there's this final evolution. And I'm getting to my point here at the end. The reemergence during the Peloponnesian War of more fluid battle. The battle lines of hostilities are less clear and defined. It's less autistic and ritualized and crystallized. You know, during the high polis era, men would go to war. There was a delineated preset field of battle. There was a ritual to denote victor or defeated, but that all went away when the war between these major city-states, between hegemonies themselves, were not simply waging a war on the battlefield conventionally, but they were also waging irregular warfare, so raids, fighting, basically skirmishes, peltasts, javelin throwing, sabotage, all that kind of stuff, but also political ones. So they were infiltrating each other's city-states, each other's territory, and basically doing what we do right now, or any country does, and probably most prominently we can mention the Cold War, for instance. All those coups and counter-coups, those insurgencies, counter-insurgencies, and their various alliances to either the Soviet Union or the United States. It should give you understanding of what it was like to fight in the Peloponnesian War. Things became irregular. There was no set rule anymore. The only rule that was stripped down to reality was power and force, and the threat of reprisal. And as the 20-year Peloponnesian War dragged on, fewer and fewer conventions were adhered to. This is just like, remember, the World War II theater campaign, where the Marines were in the Pacific, and the Japanese didn't ascribe to the same quote-unquote laws of war, but really it's just the ritual and conventions of war that the Westerners are used to. Things really deteriorated really quickly to simply brutal death, dog-eat-dog situation, okay? And going forward, what happens is, during this stage of the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks start fleshing out once more peltasts, for instance, skirmishers who are javelin throwers and light infantry. Archers, once again, take to the battlefield. Cavalrymen, most prominently, have decisive roles, once again. And then later, of course, you start to see in the Macedonian era the phalanges. So basically, dudes who were organized in a phalanx formation, but most importantly, they had a big, massive pike. Instead of an 8-foot spear, they had a massive 20-foot sarissa. And the conventions of war started to favor, mostly, the war of leaders, of guile, of skill. So, the Greeks, especially of the old hoplite tradition, looked down on trickery and ruse de guerre because they thought it was lacking valor. And to a certain extent, I can sympathize with that. To be frank with you, I like man against man, shield against shield, sword against sword. But the reality of war is far from that. And I'll tell you what, once more, war, especially in the modern era, it comes in more subtle and deceiving guises. Take, for instance, the Cold War. How many acts of sabotage existed in the United States? Assassins of communists killed JFK, assassination, right? Crazy things like Havana Ray, microwaving diplomats' brains and State Department CIA individuals from afar, or, let's see, a whole bunch of naughty, innocuous things. But if we transport ourselves to the modern era, right now, people, our enemies, our adversaries, are using legal means, ostensibly, to secure adversarial ends, right? So, for instance, China buys up massive tracts of farmland in Canada and the United States. It has a massive lobbying effort that goes on and buys politicians on both sides of the aisle. It has a very strong, I guess what you would say, infiltration of the armed services. Routinely, we see Ethnicon leaking information to the PRC, as well as, of course, your regular American-born guy getting corrupted into basically betraying our country. For instance, what comes to mind is a submariner who gave away technology, or was going to ostensibly a hostile power, and ended up being a sting, and he was caught, thank God, because our submarine force is the preeminent of the world. It's one of our, I guess it's our magic 8-ball in war, so please be aware of that, how important it is to conceal a lot of the top secret stuff that we have. But this is the guise of warfare, and things as you may think as innocuous as immigration is used as a weapon. I mean, it always is. It's always adversarial to the interests of the host country, the host nation. Going back to antiquity, tyrants of all kinds, throughout the world, used the introduction of foreign populations to divide and conquer the polity within. So instead of the tyrant having to worry about an honest citizen body uniting overwhelmingly against him, what he does is he brings in a whole bunch of foreigners who are of foreign means and background, who are beholden to him, who support him no matter what, because structurally speaking they have no other alternative. And what they do is basically instigate fights between these base elements, these new coming elements, so that way they solidify their power, just like Mao did. So Mao perpetrated the Cultural Revolution and made sure that his underlings were fighting constantly, and there was constant turnover, and this is how he stayed in power. So all the chaos and political frustration and conflict was happening on the lower levels, but on the upper levels he was good to go. The ruling class was firmly held in place. And so you see this now, for instance, you see articles that seem contradictory. At one time, migration's awesome, the West has become less Western, and so on. And then conversely, in the same breath, they say that migration is being used as a weapon, and that it causes crime and financial drain of Western countries. Like, for instance, immigration has been so expensive for the Netherlands that their entire oil field that they discovered in their territory, that they expand and goes to their state treasury, was expended on assimilating migrants, giving them free housing, all this kind of stuff, all this bullshit, right? Of course, any Westerner gets fucked, right? But they get special taken care of because, like I said, the elites that are in control of the West, especially since, roughly speaking, I would say before even World War I, are hostile to the interests of actual Westerners. These people are men of no country. Men and women. You can't even call them men. And no, this is not an allusion to the classic handles, because there are people that are of, diverse ethnic descent, but who are simply tyrants in the original classical sense, leveraging these levers of division to solidify their own control. And what's worse, they commit these grave acts of betrayal and sedition for very basic means. I mean, their end goal, end state, is just the accumulation of wealth and what they deem to be power, right? They think that these people are merchants, right? They're filthy merchants, and so they think that power is just having the money, and they're doing nothing with it. I mean, look at like Bezos, for instance. Like, what is he doing with that cash? What is his vision? He has no greater vision. I mean, he just hangs out with people. He's just lame, and ultimately people are understanding the situation. But to bring it full circle, the reason why we are talking about classical Greece and why the ethics from the past echo into the future is because the necessities of the past find themselves rearing their head in the present day. And it's by seeking the past, not simply the spiritual, monumental history, in the words of Nietzsche, to gas you up, to tell you that impossible things are possible, that human agency and will is possible, that it can overcome any odd. The inverse is true as well, but what I'm trying to say is that when we're arming ourselves on the battles of Vietnam, for instance, or we're going against adversaries who don't share our mores or our proclivities and convictions, we really got to drop the good boy attitude. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's it's in the interest of our own home country. There are higher laws than simply those scribbled by men on pieces of paper, especially those men who scribble them are corrupt themselves and bought. So ultimately, I'm familiar with and a devotee of Napoleon. A man who saves his country violates no law, because there's usually a higher law. And we see that further on, right? We understand that we have to be perspicacious about the threats of the future. And we have to start perceiving things outside of a moral lens and start seeing them from a physical one, from physics, right? From seeing how the actions of others end up affecting us, even if ostensibly they're innocuous or they're supposed to be conventionally innocuous. You only owe morals and good standing and reputation with your friends. You do not owe good reputation or standing with your enemies. You're trying to destroy them, and they're trying to destroy you. There's no such thing as universal ethics in the sense that everyone's a brother or a sister universally. This is stupid, and this is designed to make you a slave, okay? So please be aware of that. But the final tie-in, and a reference to Vietnam, as a conflict in general. Like I said before, the Peloponnesian War was a breaking of many conventions and discarding of many rituals. It laid bare what war really is about. It's about the will and subjugating or destroying it, right, in the enemy. The Vietnamese weren't simply doing cheap tactics, quote unquote, compared to the enemy, or to their enemy, the Americans. They were also, at the behest of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, subverting the United States through a decades-long program of cultural subversion and demoralization. And what does this look like? Well, it manifests itself in the hippie movement, in the destruction and criticism of the family via its vehicles, of course, of feminism, communism, liberalism, whatever you want to call it. All those things are not signs of progress. They're just weaponized deterioration. And we have lived under the influence and the prominence of those quote-unquote cultural values for so long that we're finally able to see what it results in. And what does it result in? Well, it results in the boomers. It results in a generation, heuristically of course, not all of them, but a generation of sellouts and self-prostitutes, people who only think of themselves, sell out their country, have no general perception of a future. They live in this like mystery fandom world of do-gooders and peace man and pacifism. Pacifism is let's say, it's the preserve of the slave. Only the slave is concerned about peace and harmony and happiness and whatever, any free man is by definition a warrior. Any free man is by definition constantly not simply defending against the incursions of wills alien to him and adversarial to him and his interests, but he is always effusing it. He is always seeking to conquer others. Okay? This is the ethic that we have to understand. We have to be penetrating others and being wary of being subverted or usurped. The situation that we find ourselves in the United States is one readily fixed. And what it requires is the overcoming of things which have been artificially grafted on since not just 1965, but 1776 too. The Masonic liberal BS has nothing to do with the American nation. Nope. The American nation is actually the people, the Anglo-Saxons and their tradition, the ethne, right, that built their polis on this new world. It is to them that we owe our loyalty. It is by their good graces that we understand ourselves. And it is through them that we can understand the friend-enemy distinction, and which we can categorize the actions of enemies, which may seem innocuous, as hostile or not, or a threat or not. So, bear this all in mind, but the reason why we reference these things and these events is because what we need is a little bit of the Helene in us today. In fact, a whole bunch. We need to understand our home as a polis. A polis is not just anyone shit out on the earth with a piece of paper. Okay, a citizen of a polis is a man or woman who fights for it actively, who is of it, who actively seeks to better themselves and those around them, who acts in good faith, and who fights in the interests of the Politeia, right? People who don't do that, they're not citizens. They're subjects, or worse, they're subversives. Further, spirituality has to be reimagined. The spirituality of our time really just amounts to, oh, my life, it just sucks, man. Everything sucks. Oh. And then, you get on your knees, you either pray to God or whatever made up bullshit, new religion is on the horizon that promises you happiness in the afterworld because you're a loser now and the things hurt so bad. No, that has to stop. Run towards pain. This is what Lance's Legion, if you can take anything from my freaking transmissions, is one teaching is this. You want to unlock the secrets of life, the abundance of life. You want to become perfect. You want to become excellent. You want to agathos. Well, run towards pain. Pain is not something which is the enemy. It is a friend. A friend who teaches you not simply how to be strong, but how to actually experience the catharsis of pleasure. People don't understand that without pain, there is no pleasure. There is no euphoria. The most strong circuiting in our nervous system is pain-related, not pleasure-related. Okay? Dopamine and all those cheap chemicals ultimately don't mean anything. And the will is honed by pain, running towards it and developing a part of your brain which is a nexus, which is called, one second here, it's called the Anterior Midcingulate Cortex. Short is aMCC. And this sector of your brain is actually what's responsible for regulating your choices, interpreting events outside of yourself, and basically game theory, right? So basically assuming how much of your muscle, your body can accustom itself to an obstacle, how it can overcome it, and whether the activity is worth the squeeze. And the more that you throw yourself at this adversarial position in life, the more willful you are. In fact, in centenarians, it has been seen and observed that this part of the brain is more developed than in those that are obese or dope addicts and so on. So obviously there's a correlation. This is honed by anticipating discipline, by focusing yourself on a life of excellence and virtue, having no interest, just like the Spartan, in cheap distraction. Everything will be focused on excellence, in whatever pursuit it may be. Ancient polytheism had a great way of expounding or fleshing out the excellences of an archetype. There are 12 gods. Each has their prerogative. Each has their specific thing that they focus on, that is their preserve, that they're excellent at. And make no mistake, when I have this warrior ethos, the reason why is because it's the foundation for everything else. All the great sciences come from traditions of highly disciplined individuals, culture, etc. Plato himself, though he came from Athens, remember, he was a hoplite, and Socrates as well, who wanted to be remembered so. These things come from specifically martial virtues first, not those of the slave. Slaves to our passion ultimately become the slaves of others. The mission of Lance's Legion is not to simply recount these things and allude to them based on their practical prescience in time. The purpose is to show you what right looks like, how much better we could be, what we could do. And so, when I show you these ancient Greeks, what they experienced, how they expounded the virtues of war, the aesthetic appeal of life, and also the various things that they gave honor to, and how they lived their life for their not simply for their family or for some weird abstract laws or something like that, but for their city. They gave their lives for their city, for 1,000 generations before them and 1,000 generations after them. That is what America needs to be. America needs to be refounded. And that kindling, that fertility, will be brought to us by this ancient well of spiritual power that we call ancient Greece. So, my legionaries, I show you my plan. It's important to understand the priorities in life, to understand what we're supposed to be fighting for and what we're fighting against, how to fight, how to live, how to give value to our lives, and what kind of standing it is that we should hold in each other's vision, high or low, etc. Like I said before, I'll be linking all the reading material in the description. This is just supposed to be a brief. I hope you actually do take the time and read it. This book doesn't just cover the Greeks, it covers the Romans, and I will be making another series that will be expounding on Roman Virtue and going more into depth on that. However, there are other things that I think you should really read. Like I said, I'll have the scientific articles backing up my claims as far as manifestation, the cerebral capacity to actually affect outcomes in the material world. In addition to that study about willpower, developing that brain component within your mind to will things and to persevere through hardship and to overcome and to perceive things more accurately too. That's the other thing. It's about efficiency and force. This is what that part of the brain actually develops. But most importantly, develop your virtue and develop your body. As always, be physically fit, mentally tough, and always be there for your polis, for the Republic. This is Lance's Legion. This is Sergeant Barnes, as always, in the background. And this is Agonia, signing off.